Hey, okay. Thanks everyone for coming and Peter for joining us. So,
Thanks for having me.
yes, today's session is about community building, and I'm very happy to have Peter, who is the only founder or co-founder of MetaCartel DAO, and the associated community around that.
One of the early helpers.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So, early community members. Okay, amazing. So I guess for a lot of people in the audience, they'll already know who you are. But for the others, could you just give like a quick introduction to yourself, how you got into the community building space, as well as, I guess, DAOs, which are sort of at least tangentially related to profit sharing communities. I mean, really, they're a less specific form of a profit sharing community, I think.
Yeah, it's fascinating that I got involved with DAOs because I originally never really cared too much about governance in DAOs, and it was only when I guess rejected for my first ever DAO I tried to get into. I really became fascinated about DAOs. And
Wow.
this was kind of, it started all of Moloch DAO in early 2019. So for those who don't know, after the DAO hack of Ethereum, right, there was kind of this lull within Ethereum, at least within the community around DAOs. And it was DAOs, I guess the concept of DAOs were highly theoretical. People put DAOs in, the white paper roadmaps. People talked about community governance, but it never really happened, right? And it seemed
Yeah.
very high level for most of prior to 2019, but 2019 Moloch DAO was this DAO that was just like about grants giving, right? And it was a
Yep.
very simple MVP that just like figured out a way to give out money very trustlessly. And that really resparked, the DAO interest within Ethereum. And, you could call that the 4-minute mile, right? After, the 4-minute mile was run, everyone started launching DAOs. And I guess I was part of that, kind of train, right? That came along and was like, hey, we can use DAOs today. Let's play them. Let's experiment, right? And, I tried to join Moloch DAO, the earlier kind of, first kind of 4-minute mile of DAO, right? And I was rejected because I was too poor and I didn't have enough Twitter followers, basically. I was like, why don't we fork Moloch DAO and give out grants on the application layer? Like, if MetaCartel were pre-existing community folks and meta transactions and other topics, right, on the application layer. And we were thinking about like, how do you build a Dapp incubator to help people build more Dapps? Mostly because no one was building products on Ethereum back in 2019, and everyone's still stuck in infrastructure, right? So we were like, let's create a grants giving DAO for Dapps, and yeah, we kind of just forked it and we ran with it, and since then we've kind of built many different DAOs and worked on many different things.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different strands there. So I think, like, just realized we're saying the word DAO a lot without actually introducing what it is for some of the audience members that might not know. So a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. It's essentially a kind of governance system managing typically a treasury inside Ethereum, and really governing any kind of smart contract system is a reasonable way of putting it, I think.
Roughly, right? I mean, DAOs, the idea behind DAOs is kind of like, we should all be able to own the products that, that we're using and the communities that we're part of, right? And that, we should have collective community governance over the networks that we belong to, right? Rather than, just traditionally, having, no ownership, being basically, a serfdom, if you will, right?
Right. And there are people that take the idea further and basically say that it's any kind of organization which is governed by code. And so you can sort of, by that logic, argue that Bitcoin, the base layer, and indeed Ethereum's base layer is also kind of a DAO where the miners are taking part in governance by what code they choose to run in the network, and so how they apportion hash power. But yeah, like, then the more recent experiments are also sort of focused on this idea of communities governing the things that they're part of in some form. And a lot of that
like
is
treasuries.
Exactly.
Like treasuries, protocols, on-chain protocols, anything, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And then this kind of, so we've sort of taken this idea in the Arweave ecosystem and morphed it to say, well, what if you just had a profit sharing system on top of that? So your ownership structure, or your ownership share is proportionate to the amount of the profit that you accrue from the application that you guys are collectively building. and then you have governance on top of that. So it's like a DAO plus micro dividend system, essentially. So that's sort of how the origin of profit sharing communities fits in with this. But maybe you can take us back a little bit to how the MetaCartel community got started, because of course DAOs are basically like on-chain representations of ownerships of communities in some form. And the more interesting part here, I think, for us in this discussion is not just DAOs, but also like how those communities themselves are formed, how you might go around building a community around your application, or go about building a community around your application, such that you actually can have some kind of decentralized ownership. Because of course, just having a DAO doesn't really mean that you have any kind of decentralized ownership or governance. You really also have to have the community around it.
Yeah, it's like you have the house, but then you also need the house part, right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
So the story of MetaCartel is kind of weird because we were originally just like a technical working group working kind of UX solutions for Ethereum, and yeah, we solved various problems, and we kind of formed as a community during that point. We had all our memes, all our memes, I guess, originated from that era, right? And hence the name MetaCartel. Yeah. We were Meta Transactions Working Group, and we wanted to call ourselves something interesting beyond just working group, right? So like Meta Transactions Cartel, like the pun was, we're the only group working on this thing, and we want others to know more about it. But like, since we're the only ones working on this, we're like the cartel of Meta Transactions contributors, right? And so that was kind of the how the group formed. But I would say that it's with community building, it's kind of really more about how do you build an environment where people want to be a part of, right, and belong to. And this is kind of like the crux of like, I think why it's so hard to build a online community, right? It's really hard to build relationships online as well in general. So I think what we did with MetaCartel was that even though we were working on like UX solutions and we were working on other things aside from that, we were always very focused on kind of end user like outcomes, and kind of, I guess, we had this I guess even from the beginning, even though we didn't solely define our culture, we had this really strong sense of like we wanted to build things that were useful and that push experimentation forward in the application layer. We wanted to move fast, and we were willing to do it while having some fun, right? And these things pull together really interesting people, and it kind of shows that like communities like need to be. I guess you don't always need to nail down everything about a community from day one, but you do need to have something that's compelling, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so that's interesting. You guys basically started with a mission, right? And then the community built around the mission, and the culture almost came as you were going towards the mission in the early stages, and then I guess it cemented, or is that not quite?
I think we started with problems to solve, right? And we centered around that, and it was, I guess, in a way, mission, like, I guess not in a broader sense, but more like we want to solve X, Y, and Z, or standardize these, contract functions, right? And so on. And I guess, the culture was shaped by the early community members that were involved, and, I think like the mix of personalities were kind of the secret ingredient that, I guess bled into the culture, right? And I think it was we kind of like facilitated in a way that was very, community driven as well. It wasn't one party or one group dominating the conversation and collaboration. It was truly like many different like teams in the space and individuals and countries coming together to work on meta transactions. And I think that, when you kind of put your own personal interests above like, you put, I guess, a collective community interest above your own and your own team's interest to some extent, right? With a level of compromise, you really do foster the sense of like giving, and that is like a positive something that just like kind of sparks this sense of like this contributing culture, right? And which like really did exist, early on with MetaCartel, which I think we were very lucky to have. But yeah, the culture was kind of like developed over time, but from the very beginning, there was a sense of like we can go much farther, like if we can work together on the stuff, right? And everyone was aligned with that, everyone was on board with that, and that's why everyone kind of contributed and helped out.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So you've been writing about like community building affairs for quite a while now. I actually remember when you first shared, I think it was the MetaCartel Ventures. What was it? Not manifesto, but some kind of like. Oh no. There was some like founding document or mission document for MetaCartel, but you shared it as an Arweave link, and so I went back and looked at your wallet, and I saw that there were a whole bunch of stuff you'd submitted to the chain, and one of those was like this kind of beautiful story about the Ethereum Hero, and that actually really like stuck
God.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
So you get
yeah.
But yet, I thought a lot of the issues you were raising in there were actually very pertinent and very few people were talking about. Like maybe you could give like a brief outline of what that was.
So first of all, that's crazy that like you're aware of that for some digging. But yeah, like the Ethereum the story, what was, I wrote this like kind of like a fable story, right?
Yeah.
Of like the cycle, the emotional roller coaster, of a typical Ethereum contributor or just crypto hero in the space that, tries to contribute, find ways to add value. They find greater, meaning, like they kind of like the work takes off. They're lauded by the community, they're promoted, they're kind of riding the highs of the social capital, right? That they're finding themselves in. And, it goes through the cycle of like this, the mania, and then like the point in which they realize that, you don't really feed yourself with social capital. And then they realize how fickle social capital is, right? And they go through the contemplations of like, oh my God, what am I in this space for? And, basically it's a hero's journey story, right? Of a high and a low and a level of, level-headedness, right? Where, heroes always end up with. And essentially it was the story kind of like, one part, is derived from my own experiences, just like building things in the space, right? But also, learning from like and experiencing and also witnessing many other creators in the space building public goods, essentially. Right. It's a fact that, you basically don't, there's very little upside. As also like no one really looks out for you when you actually try to add a ton of value in the space. Basically, it's kind of like, a story that I wrote to kind of warn people who are like embarking on this journey of like, I'm going to just create something great and add a ton of value to the community, and the community is going to reward me, and the community is going to appreciate that. And yes, in a way, but it also kind of exposes and tries to communicate the realities of like the real problem of Treasure of the Commons, essentially, in this space, right? That's what it was, really.
That's fascinating. It's a great read for anyone listening that wants to check it out. You'll find it on BitSearch, the Arweave search engine. I'm sure it's indexed. Okay, that's super fascinating, and it begs at kind of one of the questions that has arisen in the community since the birth of profit sharing, or in the ecosystem since the birth of profit sharing communities, which was that like for a long time we were really excited and still are about people just building open source web applications, but they are fundamentally kind of public goods. So the incentives are very different to build them. One of the things that's very interesting, I think, about profit sharing communities is it's like you can still build this open source piece of code that does something and contributes it to the world, but at the same time, there's some financial upside for the founders. Taking part in it. Like they can just create this passive income stream essentially, and they could also monetize that passive income stream whenever they want, which is reasonably powerful and I think very powerful. And I think a lot of people from the ecosystem are starting to catch on to that and run with it. But it's certainly the case that there's really interesting dynamics at play in these crypto communities around public goods and who builds them and how they're rewarded and how they're perpetuated. That aren't really very well explored, I would say. So that's a great read. I really liked it. Okay, cool. And since then you've been writing more on your blog, I think, about community building. I mean, maybe you could just take us through, like, if you're an Arweave profit sharing community founder, or at least like on the technical side, you've founded a profit sharing community. So you've got a contract, you've got some ownership, and you've got a web application which is going to reward people that own parts of that contract for their ownership. Okay, you're at this stage. Like, what on earth do you do to try and seed the community in the first place? How do you get that like 0 to 1?
Right, a lot of the 0 to 1 stuff is pretty hot, right? But
Hmm.
You know, but I think it's ultimately, at the essence, it's fairly straightforward. But in the sense that community building is really about building something that people want to be a part of. Sounds
Yeah.
simple, but that's super, super hard, right? Like people are distracted all the time, people part of many different things, the time is committed all over the place, right? Why would they want to come to your community and spend time then, let alone contribute, right? So like,
Hmm.
this is where I think you have to really think about, why are you building this project, right? Why are you building this product and, PSTing this product, right? Like, tokenizing it, etc., right?
Yeah.
And I think these are the questions at the core that, I think you have to be, maybe not answer from the start, but thinking about them, right, and discussing them, and you want to keep asking why, of like, I guess, like, you really want to dig deep down into like your, and understand, like, the sort of values and principles that you want to build your project with, right? And I think, like,
Yeah.
generally, if you build work on interesting problems, you'll find interesting people. And what, community building is about is really signaling like what these projects stand for, right? And I
Hmm.
guess in terms of like how you convert them into contributors, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the next step. But you do need to find a compelling reason to communicate, right? Maybe not
Right.
reason, but like a compelling story, essentially, right? Yeah,
Interesting. Okay. All right. So you need some kind of vision that people can align themselves around in some sense, like a reason to be part of this thing. Where is this thing going?
essentially.
Um, yeah. Now, one of the things we've obviously noticed, because basically been doing this in the Arweave community now for what, like 3 years, uh, it it really starts to take form when people kind of befriend each other, and then there's like this strong mesh of social connections between people in the ecosystem. And that's when you really get a little bit of strength to the thing, and growing that over time. Yeah, is, as far as I can tell, and we're very much still in the process of doing this, but as far as I can tell, that's how these things scale, because it's like, random people in the community being friends with other random people in the community. But of course, when you're the founder, there's this moment where you are like the pin that connects all of the different strands. And so one of the things I always try and do is like connect different founders of profit sharing communities in the ecosystem to each other so that they develop those connections rather than it being like based on the core team. But that does take this little tricky, um, how would you say, tricky kind of social development stage
Well,
where
well,
at
look,
some,
like,
sorry, go on.
there's
Yeah.
audiences, and then there's
Right.
communities, right? There's like they're very two
Uh-huh.
different things.
Yes.
Most people online have audiences, but they don't
Yeah.
necessarily have a community, right? Like, for example, like, someone may have a lot of Twitter followers, right? And they may have
Hmm.
they have a great large, audience to talk to and engage with, but that their
Yeah.
audience may not engage with one another. That's not a community, right?
Right.
That a community
Yeah.
is where, like, people within the community are here for a shared common reason or cause, right? Under
Hmm.
a similar context, a shared context, and they're engaging and collaborating and interacting with one another. That's really what makes a
Yeah.
community, right? And what
It's
you
like
just
many to
described,
many rather than
yeah, it's many
exactly.
to many to versus one to many, right? And what you
Yeah.
described with connecting different, PSD founders, right, is really like, you're really developing this, like, um, the interactions and these relationships amongst a community, right? That's what
Yeah.
really, like you said, it makes it scale, right? Because, um,
Hmm.
yeah, essentially, you know, and I think that's a large part of the community building as well, is just like curating individuals, right? And curating
Hmm.
the quality of the community. I mean, one side, it's like you're curating through how you communicate and how you present the community, right? And the other side, it's like,
Yeah.
this more purposeful curation where you're connecting and you're forging, connections and, pathways with one another, right? Um,
Yeah.
and then, of course, you have like the more discrete, like more intentional, I guess, the other side of curation, where you're trying to almost also filter out individuals too. It's like this tension between, exclusivity and inclusivity. And I think,
Yeah.
there's a level of meaningfulness that comes with like very mindful and, purposeful curation that, like, there is a trade-off with, right? But it's not either or, and it's more like a spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's really complex and interesting interplays in the crypto space, particularly regarding community building around speculators and code contributors, so kind of developers, and also social contributors. And people can be, members of multiple of those groups, but those groups kind of play different roles in the ecosystem. And I'm reminded, and I think this is something that the profit sharing community founders will also have to deal with. I'm reminded of how the Arweave community really got started and really got growing when we just actually decided to bifurcate the community. We made an Arweave chat server, which was basically unmoderated. You can say whatever you like. And that there's like, someone from the team is there. So there's Dan, he chats to people and like forwards messages that need like important responses from the Arweave core team. But other than that, it's basically just people on their own chatting to each other. And this is generally inhabited by people speculating on the Arweave token. And then there's this developer Discord server and community, which is really where like the people that are building stuff or socially contributing hang out. And it was a tough decision to make to kind of try and bifurcate the community like this, because it didn't feel as what would you say, as decentralized as we would want it to be. It's quite a top-down decision almost. And also like in the developer server, we do reasonably heavily moderated. If like you're just talking about token price, we will politely send you to speak in the chat server. But I think that it was only through that taking that action to separate the people that were really like actively contributing from the people that were just purely speculating that we got to a good point in the community in the first place. I mean, what are your thoughts around like the interplay between speculation, contribution, and the likes in crypto?
Yeah, it's nice that you did that, because these gardens, they do need gardeners, right? Essentially,
right.
Or else the hedges go wild and it becomes a jungle, right? So that's one misconception that it's not about top down decision making. It's about it was leadership from your standpoint, right? And maybe you could make these decisions in a more community driven manner by just getting rough consensus from community or et cetera, right? But these communities do require like leadership, right? And that's what you kind of display there, right? In terms of like kind of separating these groups, I think I think it's like a matter of like I think like early on in community, it's like it's up to the core team to set the tone of what the community engages in, and what sort of discussions the community participates in, right? And I think if individuals from the community come in and start discussing things that are not of objective value to the community, or not to the goals of the community, right? I think easily you could moderate that, right? I think like these community environments earlier on, you have to be much more specific to, I guess, how you want to shape and craft them. And yeah, like, if people want to talk about miscellaneous items and maybe price talk, or et cetera, give them an area to do so. But I think ultimately you need to be decisive on the culture and the tone of the environment that you want to create, right? So, if you're building like, a product community where you want developers and contributors to get involved, right? You want to prioritize that over a speculative community. And sometimes, they're all equally important, right? They're all community members. This is where I think, you do need to, it is kind of like earlier on, you do need to focus on one area or another, but as you grow bigger, maybe the priorities kind of balance out. That's when I think, it makes sense to kind of like curate and almost class the community. Maybe there's a community shares a common ground, but there are, kind of like inner guilds, right, if you will, or inner circles, or different circles that individual community members can belong to, which are much more focused and curated on the specific goals, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, like, it's certainly true to almost every crypto project, one way or another. Speculation or speculators are a really valuable part of the community. It's just, there's just, yeah, exactly. Sometimes it's about giving the different actors and participants in the thing that you're building a different space to talk to each other, because they'll almost develop a different culture. Like, one of the things we found with Arweave is that because we made this split fairly early on, the developer culture and the culture of people that are like, you might say socially contributing. So for example, a guy called Woombat is building this Arweave wiki, which is amazing. It's awesome. He's just like putting a whole bunch of information about how you use Arweave in one place, making it hyperlinks between. It's a great project, but it's a social contribution more than it is a development contribution. So he's like a regular person on the Arweave Discord server, Arweave developer Discord server. But then I kind of noticed that the speculator community have actually reformed on Telegram. They call themselves the Arweavers, and they have a very, very different culture than the developers do. It's kind of okay. Like, they're both valuable participants in the network. It's just you almost have to like allow them different spaces so that the cultures can be different. Because if they try and like nest on top of each other, it doesn't really work so well. In my experience.
Yeah, it's really hard to build a culture that's both good at memes and both good at like code. Right. It kind of really requires different sorts of people, and and different environments. If let others thrive more than others, right? So that's really the reality of things. And I think it's totally fine to let these kind of different groups emerge.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. Okay, so one of the other questions I had for you was, what are the kind of signals that you should look for, early signals in a community that something good is starting to happen, and what you can like double down on? Like, when you're founding your profit sharing community, typically people end up building a Discord server, they flesh it out with a few different channels. And then, the founder is there talking to people whenever they emerge. But where do you think the like inflection points are on the way to building a successful community?
Well, usually, community members need to get involved in something. Right. So I guess thinking from like a point of a open source software project, right, as all Web3 projects really are, it's, these PSTs and I guess even just governance in general, the extensions of open source, like if you want to build a community where individuals are contributing, right, and adding value and participating in the project, right, you need to figure out a way to basically onboard individuals and give people like, and empower them to basically contribute, right? And
interesting.
So, I guess that's one side of it. The other side is like, community building essentially is like a lot of it is relationship building, right? It's making people feel like, they're welcome to the community and they're empowered to contribute, and that if they contribute, they're going to be rewarded, and that they matter, and that they have a voice, right? And that, the community has values that they align with, right? It's like not everyone belongs to every community, right? It's different people belong to different communities, different things resonate to more than others, right? It's that's kind of how things work, but it's really being clear about what you want to build, right? So like in terms of like the vanity metrics of community building, I think it's kind of like it doesn't really matter how many people are in your Discord or like how many people are like in your Telegram, etc. It's really what really matters is kind of like how often are you in touch and building, and I guess in meaningful contact, right, and building a relationship with your community members. If you really want to think about metrics, maybe it's like how many people come to these community calls where you're discussing on how to make the project better, or feedback sessions, right? Like commitments of time, energy, and creativity, like even memes, right, for example, are like great signs that you're creating an environment that people want to be a part of, and that they're investing time and energy. What's really important is when you identify that, right? It's basically empowering them to do more, right? Rewarding them, making sure that they feel acknowledged and they are acknowledged, right? That's a big and then there's this feedback cycle when when you contribute, you should get that kick, and it's kind of like behavior cycles to some extent, right? Everyone really operates off them.
Yeah, totally. It's really interesting. A few of our core investors came back to us recently wanting to buy some more tokens. And I was like, okay, maybe we'll sell you some. That's fine. But then like we got into this conversation, like, wouldn't it be nice to set up some kind of call where we can like update all the things that have changed since last year? Sure, let's do that. That's a great idea. But then I was trying to find a way of boiling down like all of the community growth since profit sharing communities emerged in the ecosystem. And there is just no objective measure really that is helpful to describe community strength and cohesiveness. It's very, very tricky. I think like for all the profit sharing community founders in the ecosystem, my general advice would be just focus on the qualitative stuff, at least in the early stages. Like, yeah, what contributions are people making? How frequently are people coming back and talking to each other? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, community building is a lot of like grueling work that's ultimately really unscalable, right? Because you're trying to essentially
Yeah.
build like, you know, you're building, this community of like, I guess, contributors, and you only need, and it's kind of like about figuring out attracting one new potential contributor, every week, every month, or whatever, and kind of like taking them along the journey to becoming like a fully fledged like core contributor, for example, right? If you will,
Yeah.
if you think of that as a goal, and you only need to repeat that process, several times before you actually get a critical mass. Before you have 5 really active contributors, and then 10, and then 11, and then 12, and by the time you like hit 13, right, like core contributors, active contributors, they're all by themselves bringing other people in, and they're evangelizing by themselves, they're sharing more about it, and other people, actually, like if you think about 10 people's 10 people is a lot of people, and if you think about where they line the individual social graphs, right, that's a lot of reach. And I think for someone who's like kind of seen the critical mass take place, it's a really astounding I guess effect that you never really could imagine, right? That you just need to like, once you built up this whole core tribe of people, that it really grows from there very organically, right? So kind of my advice to like early community builders is just like focus on building like a real family that people belong to and can contribute to, and feel like they identify with, right? And just like focus on bringing one more person into that tribe, into that clan or the guild, right? And taking care of them, and um, and learning about them, being curious about them, building that relationship with them, right? And just like one by one, like you have to like kind of put. There's definitely, I think, if you've never built a community before and seen that kind of critical mass take point, I guess my suggestion would be to somewhat trust that process, because it does exist, and when it does emerge, it's actually quite fulfilling, and so like like this is kind of how social movements do take place. It's when one person believes, and then another, and another, and another, and people start contributing, committing the time and energy, and and what really matters at that point is like, once you have several contributors, make sure it's really important to make sure the community moves somewhere, it actually achieves goals, and it progresses, and then you set milestone after milestone that are like achievable, but just hard enough to the point where like once you nail them down, it's like you're like the first milestone you nail down as a community. That's really when you become a real community, right? And you've like you've bloodied your axe, if you will, right? And you're battle worn, and you've gone through one of the you've gone through like a trial, right, and your own tribulations, and once you keep once you set those goals and you keep hitting them, you just like you find this momentum that's really unstoppable, right? And it's just about like communicating what you're working on, how people can get involved, and kind of voicing and being very purposeful about the culture and your values, and so slowly, right? Slowly, people will find you, right, and come to you. But it is an insanely slow process that takes a long time, and is generally also limited by the bounds of the ecosystem around you as well, right? So like it's very easy to build a very, very large community much quicker, I'd say, in some, I guess, within, say, the Ethereum DeFi space, because that's, like blowing up right now. But I think, with smaller technology ecosystems, it's going to take some time, right? And I actually think that's a benefit, because while the ecosystem and the communities around you are small, there's this real sense of intimacy where you can build really great relationships.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it reminds me of like when I look around the different Discord servers for the profit sharing communities that exist right now, I see like all of the names of these people that I know to be so active in the Arweave, like community channels and contributing to the Arweave ecosystem. And it's really exciting to see them already jump in and start to contribute to other stuff. I think this is starting to happen on like Arweave's Discord channel, as well as dgit, for example, to the kind of front of mind. Yeah, and it's exciting to see that there's this ecosystem of people inside Arweave that are actual like early contributors to things. And so when they get involved with the new community, it's actually it's a relatively short jump from there to really doing something, being activated. So I think that there's plus sides and negative sides to this. Like, it's definitely true that like the Ethereum ecosystem is much, much larger, but at the same time, it's actually maybe a little bit harder to activate people to really start contributing rather than speculating and so on. Relative to, at least in Arweave, we have like a relatively small ecosystem, but everybody is like an early adopter of technology and excited to get started with stuff. So I think that's a kind of asset we have on our side, but certainly there's interesting interface here. Okay, thanks so much, Peter. That was
the
an
nice thing about early communities.
Oh, yeah, go.
Yeah, no. One more point. The nice thing about small communities is that it's very easy to make yourself useful as well, and to get involved.
That's definitely true. Yeah, the barrier for entry is very low. Like, the founders of these profit sharing communities are just, I've spoken to some of them and they're just super excited when they get that first person who, like, I don't know, made a logo or something. Like, the first contribution is always incredible. It's a great feeling. Anyway, thank you so much for your time, Peter. That was super interesting. I'd love to, chat to you later potentially, and show you some of the things that the ecosystem is working on, perhaps at the demo day or something like that.
Sounds good.
Amazing. Thanks, Peter. Chat to you later.